The slap echoed through the marble foyer like a gunshot. Catherine Sterling's head snapped to the side, her silver hair falling across her face as the sharp sting radiated across her cheek. She stood frozen in the entrance of what had been her home for 23 years, staring at the man who had just struck her, Grant, the son she and Richard had raised since he was 7 years old. If this story resonates with you, subscribe to the TYCOON'S Ledger and join us as we uncover tales of justice, betrayal, and the price of greed. I said, "Shut up and get out." Grant hissed, his face twisted with contempt. Behind him, Arthur Vance, the company's CFO and Grant's co-conspirator, stood with arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "This mansion belongs to me now. The company belongs to me. Everything your precious Richard built is mine." Catherine's hand trembled as she touched her burning cheek, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not in front of them. Just 3 hours earlier, she had returned from a charity luncheon to find the locks changed, security replaced, and these two men waiting in her living room with papers declaring Grant the new majority shareholder and CEO of Sterling Industries. Her husband Richard's empire, built over 40 years from a single manufacturing plant to a global technology powerhouse, had been stolen in a corporate coup while she attended a fundraiser for children's hospitals. "You can't do this," Catherine had whispered when they first confronted her. "Richard's will hasn't even been read yet. He only passed 5 months ago." That's when Grant had laughed, a cruel, cold sound that bore no resemblance to the boy who once called her mom. "The will doesn't matter. Dad signed emergency succession documents 2 years ago when he had that health scare. I'm his heir. Arthur here helped me consolidate the board votes yesterday. 51% control. You're out." She had opened her mouth to protest, to explain that Richard had told her something different in his final days, but Grant's patience had evaporated. The slap came fast, vicious, calculated to humiliate rather than harm. Now she stood in shocked silence as Arthur stepped forward, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Mrs. Sterling, let's be reasonable. You've never worked a day in your life. You've been a decorative accessory to Richard's success, pretty at galas, silent at board meetings, useful for photo opportunities. We're being generous by not pressing trespassing charges." He paused, exchanging a glance with Grant. "Though if you'd like to stay on the property, we do have a position available. Grant's private office could use a dedicated cleaning person. The toilet sees quite a bit of use." The words hung in the air like poison. Catherine looked between the two men, Grant, whom she had tutored through college applications and celebrated at his MBA graduation, and Arthur, whom Richard had promoted to CFO just 18 months ago despite her husband's private reservations about his ethics. They wanted her broken. They wanted her begging. They wanted her to disappear into the shame they'd crafted for her. Instead, something crystallized inside Catherine's chest. It was cold and sharp and utterly clear. These men had not just stolen a company. They had desecrated Richard's memory, spat on the family they'd built, and revealed themselves as something monstrous. As she stood there, her cheeks still throbbing, Catherine made a decision that would alter all their futures. "I'll leave," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She bent down, picked up her purse from where it had fallen during the slap, and walked toward the door with her head high. Grant called after her, something crude about her finding a hotel that accepted has-beens, but Catherine didn't turn around. She simply walked out into the late September afternoon, climbed into her car, thankfully still parked in the circular driveway, and drove away from the only home she'd known for over 2 decades. But as she navigated the tree-lined streets of the Hamptons, Catherine wasn't thinking about where she would sleep that night. She was thinking about the envelope hidden in her attorney's safe, the real Richard had signed just 3 weeks before his death. The one that gave her 100% control of Sterling Industries. The one Grant and Arthur didn't know existed. And she was thinking about something else, too. A nagging suspicion about Richard's sudden decline in health, about the way he complained of persistent fatigue and confusion in those final months, about the tea Arthur had so thoughtfully prepared for him every morning during their executive briefings. Catherine Sterling had been underestimated her entire marriage. People saw the designer clothes, the charity work, the practiced smile, and assumed she was simple. Richard had known better. He built his empire, yes, but she had built the relationships that sustained it. The suppliers who trusted her word, the international partners who valued her counsel, the employees who knew she actually remembered their children's names. She'd been Richard's silent partner in every way that mattered, and now these arrogant fools would learn exactly what that meant. The slap had been meant to break her. Instead, it had forged her into something harder than either Grant or Arthur could imagine. Justice was coming, and it would be ice cold. The memory came to Catherine as she sat in her attorney's office 3 days after the eviction, staring at the sealed envelope that contained Richard's final wishes. She closed her eyes and let herself drift back to that gray October morning 5 months ago, the day they had buried her husband. The Sterling family chapel had been packed with Manhattan's elite, industry titans, and politicians who'd flown in from Washington. Catherine had stood at the front in her black Chanel suit, perfectly composed, greeting each mourner with gracious dignity. But she'd felt their eyes on her, heard the whispers that followed her like shadows. Poor Catherine. What will she do now? Richard was the brains. She was just the beauty. Grant had stood beside her, playing the grieving son with Oscar-worthy performance, his hand occasionally touching her shoulder in what observers might have mistaken for comfort, but what Catherine felt as ownership. Arthur had delivered a eulogy praising Richard's vision while carefully positioning himself as the keeper of that flame, the man who understood the founder's true intentions. After the service, during the reception at the mansion, Catherine had been treated like a relic. Board members had spoken over her. Longtime business associates had directed their condolences to Grant. When she tried to discuss the company's pending merger negotiations with a supplier from Singapore, Grant had actually taken her elbow and steered her away, murmuring that she should let the grown-ups handle business now. She'd smiled and retreated to the corner, playing the role they expected, the decorative widow, lost without her husband's guidance. But that evening, after the last guest had departed, Richard's personal attorney Marcus Chun had pulled her aside into Richard's study. He left instructions, Marcus had said quietly, producing the envelope sealed with Richard's personal stamp. "This is the real will, Catherine. Signed 3 weeks before he passed. He was very specific that you should only open it when you felt the time was right, when you understood what was truly at stake." Catherine had taken the envelope with shaking hands. But the succession documents Grant mentioned, forgeries, Marcus had said bluntly, or at best, outdated documents Richard explicitly revoked. "I have the revocation papers. Richard came to me 2 months before he died and said something was wrong. He said Grant had changed, that Arthur was poisoning the company culture, that he feared what would happen if he gave them control. He told me, Catherine is stronger than anyone knows. She'll know what to do when the wolves show themselves." She'd opened the envelope that night, alone in a hotel room, and read Richard's words. The will was crystal clear. Catherine inherited 100% of Sterling Industries' controlling shares. But more than that, Richard had left her a letter explaining his reasoning. He'd seen Grant's true nature emerging, the entitlement, the carelessness with other people's livelihoods, the hunger for power without the wisdom to wield it. He'd noticed Arthur's subtle manipulations, his efforts to isolate Richard from longtime allies, his push to sell the company to Omnicorp, Sterling Industries' most ruthless competitor. Richard's final paragraph had brought tears to her eyes. "You built this company as much as I did, Catherine. You just built the parts no one could see, the trust, the loyalty, the human connections that transform transactions into partnerships. Now you must save it from those who see only dollar signs where we built dreams." The next morning, Catherine had begun making phone calls, not to lawyers or board members, but to the network she'd cultivated over 23 years. She called Yuki Tanaka in Tokyo, whose semiconductor factory supplied Sterling's core components, and whose daughter Catherine had helped place at Harvard. She called Omar Hassan in Dubai, whose logistics company handled Sterling's Middle Eastern distribution, and whose wife Catherine had supported through cancer treatment. She called dozens of others, suppliers, distributors, manufacturing partners across 6 continents, people Richard had done business with but Catherine had built relationships with. The conversations followed a pattern. She'd explained the situation delicately, never bad-mouthing Grant directly, simply noting that there might be changes in leadership philosophy and asking a careful question. If the time came when you had to choose between a contract and a relationship, which matters more to you? Every single one had given her the same answer. They'd built their partnerships on trust, trust in the Sterling name, trust in Richard's integrity, and trust in Catherine's word. If she asked them to wait, to reconsider, to hold firm against pressure, they would. By the time Grant slapped her in the foyer 3 months later, Catherine had already constructed an invisible web across the global supply chain. She'd also hired a private investigator, not for the company, but to answer the question that haunted her dreams. Why had Richard, a man who'd been in excellent health at 72, suddenly deteriorated so rapidly? Why had his doctors been puzzled by symptoms that didn't quite fit any diagnosis? Why had he complained specifically about the tea Arthur prepared for him each morning, saying it tasted bitter but drinking it anyway because Arthur insisted it was a special blend for mental clarity? The investigators' preliminary report had arrived the day before the coup. It contained hospital records, toxicology patterns that had been dismissed as age-related decline, and a disturbing notation from Richard's physician about unusual heavy metal markers in his blood work from those final months. The doctor had recommended further testing, but Richard had died before it could be conducted. The official cause had been listed as sudden cardiac failure, common enough in men his age that no one had questioned it. But Catherine had questioned it, and now she had reason to believe the answer was murder. Sitting in Marcus Chen's office, Catherine laid out her strategy. "We'll let them think they've won," she told him. "Let them make the announcements, restructure the board, start making plans. Grant wants to sell the company to Omnicorp. I know this from the documents I found. Arthur's been negotiating it for months. They think the suppliers will have no choice but to accept the new terms Omnicorp will demand." Marcus had raised an eyebrow. "And you're going to let them get that far?" Catherine's smile had been cold. "I'm going to let them get far enough to hang themselves. And then I'm going to pull every single thread in the web I've built and watch their entire scheme collapse. But first, I need you to do something for me. I need you to quietly hire a forensic toxicologist and get Richard's medical records subpoenaed. Because I don't just want to save the company, Marcus. I want to know if my husband was murdered. And if he was, I want the men who killed him to pay for it with everything they have." The attorney had studied her for a long moment, seeing perhaps for the first time the steel beneath the polished exterior. Then he'd nodded. "Richard chose well," he'd said simply. "Let's bring them to justice." Catherine had left his office that day with the will secured, the investigation launched, and her network activated. The widow they dismissed as decorative had become something else entirely, a hunter, patient and precise, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The toxicology report arrived on a cold November morning, 6 weeks after Catherine had been evicted from her home. She sat in her modest hotel suite, deliberately chosen to maintain the appearance of a humbled widow, and read the forensic analysis with hands that grew steadier with each damning paragraph. Dr. Patricia Williamson, one of the nation's leading forensic toxicologists, had reviewed Richard's preserved blood samples, hair follicles from his hairbrush that Catherine had saved, and the medical records spanning his final 6 months. The conclusion was unequivocal. Richard Sterling had been systematically poisoned with thallium, a tasteless heavy metal that caused progressive neurological deterioration, cardiac stress, and ultimately the heart failure that had killed him. The dosing pattern suggests administration over approximately 4 months, Dr. Williamson had written. Small amounts, likely delivered daily in food or beverage, designed to mimic natural decline in an older patient. This is consistent with premeditated murder by someone with regular access to the victim's meals and knowledge of toxicology. Thallium poisoning is difficult to detect without specific testing and is often mistaken for natural illness. The perpetrator demonstrated sophistication in both dosing and timing. Catherine set down the report and stared out the window at the gray Manhattan skyline. Richard had been murdered. Her husband of 23 years, the man who'd built an empire through integrity and innovation, had been slowly killed by people he trusted. And she knew exactly who those people were. Arthur had prepared Richard's morning tea every single day during their 7:30 briefings, a ritual he'd insisted upon, claiming it promoted mental clarity for strategic discussions. Grant had been present for many of those meetings, had encouraged his father to trust Arthur completely, had even joked about the magic tea that kept the old man sharp. They had killed him together, and then they tried to steal everything he'd built. Catherine's phone buzzed. It was Marcus Chen. "Catherine, we have a problem. Grant and Arthur just sent out a company-wide memo announcing the sale to Omnicorp." They're calling it a merger, but it's a complete acquisition. They've scheduled the final signing for December 15th, 3 weeks from now. Once that deal closes, untangling it will be nearly impossible, even with the real will. Let them proceed, Catherine said, her voice calm. Has the board approved it? They rushed a vote yesterday. Past 8-4. The dissenting members are already being pressured to resign. Catherine, if we're going to act, it needs to be soon. Once Omnicorp's lawyers are involved. I understand. But timing is everything, Marcus. I need them to make one more mistake. Just one. She paused. Has Arthur sent the new contract terms to the suppliers yet? There was a shuffle of papers on Marcus's end. According to my sources inside the company, those went out this morning. Standard Omnicorp terms, 20% price reductions, extended payment schedules, elimination of the profit-sharing agreements Richard had established. Several suppliers are already calling the office trying to reach Grant or Arthur. Catherine felt a cold satisfaction settle in her chest. And how are Grant and Arthur responding to those calls? They're not. Arthur sent a memo to all department heads instructing them to inform suppliers that the terms are non-negotiable. Any supplier who refuses to sign within 72 hours will have their contracts terminated immediately and replaced with Omnicorp's existing vendors. He actually used the phrase, easily replaceable commodities in reference to the partnership network. There it was. The fatal mistake she'd been waiting for. Catherine had spent decades building relationships with these suppliers, attending their children's weddings, supporting them through economic downturns, celebrating their successes as if they were family. Richard had structured profit-sharing agreements that made them partners in Sterling's success rather than merely vendors. And now Grant and Arthur, in their arrogance, had just treated these partners like interchangeable parts in a machine. Marcus, it's time. Contact the board members who voted against the sale and tell them to be ready for an emergency meeting. I'm invoking my rights under the corporate charter to call for a shareholder vote. And I'm going to need you to coordinate with Detective Sarah Martinez at the Manhattan DA's office. Tell her I have evidence of homicide and I'm ready to present it. Over the next 48 hours, Catherine's carefully constructed web pulled tight. Yuki Tanaka in Tokyo was the first to respond to Arthur's ultimatum. Instead of signing, he sent a formal letter terminating Sterling Industries' contract effective immediately, citing fundamental breach of partnership values. Within hours, Omar Hassan in Dubai followed suit. Then suppliers in Germany, Brazil, Singapore, India and Mexico. By the end of the second day, 87% of Sterling Industries' global supply chain had canceled their contracts. The company's production ground to a halt, without components, without logistics support, without the manufacturing partnerships that had taken decades to build. Sterling Industries couldn't fulfill a single order. The Omnicorp deal, predicated on Sterling's operational capacity and supplier relationships, began to crumble. Omnicorp's lawyers started making angry calls about misrepresentation of assets. The stock price, which had been climbing on acquisition rumors, plummeted 23% in a single trading day. Catherine watched the news coverage from her hotel room, her expression neutral. Grant appeared on CNBC looking haggard, insisting it was temporary supplier confusion that would be resolved shortly. Arthur released a statement blaming foreign interference in American business. But Catherine could see the panic in their eyes. They built their entire scheme on the assumption that Sterling's infrastructure was theirs to command. They'd never considered that the infrastructure might be loyal to someone else. On the third day, Catherine received a call from a Sterling board member, Thomas Wright, one of the 4 who'd voted against the sale. Mrs. Sterling, the board is in chaos. 3 members who voted for the acquisition are now demanding Grant's resignation. The Omnicorp deal is dead. They've withdrawn their offer citing material misrepresentation. Grant and Arthur are scrambling to contact suppliers, but no one will take their calls. What's happening? Justice, Thomas, Catherine said simply. I'm calling an emergency shareholder meeting for tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., at Sterling headquarters. I'll be presenting Richard's actual will and assuming my position as majority shareholder and CEO. I'd appreciate your support. There was a long pause. You've had control this whole time, haven't you? You let them think they'd won. I let them reveal who they truly were, Catherine corrected. Richard always said that people show you their character when they think no one's watching. Grant and Arthur showed me everything I needed to see. Now they're going to face the consequences. That evening, Catherine received the final piece of evidence she'd been waiting for. Dr. Williamson had tracked down the tea supplier Arthur had used, a specialty import shop in Chinatown. The owner remembered Arthur specifically because he'd purchased thallium sulfate from the shop's back inventory, claiming he needed it for medicinal research. The shop owner had kept records, including Arthur's signature on the hazardous materials log. Combined with Richard's medical records, witness testimony about the daily tea ritual, and forensic evidence, it was enough for an arrest warrant. Catherine called Detective Martinez. "I'm ready to file charges. Murder in the first degree, conspiracy, and corporate fraud. I'll testify to everything: the tea ritual, the progression of Richard's symptoms, the timing of the will changes, and the attempted theft of the company." "We'll need to move carefully," the detective warned. "These are powerful men with expensive lawyers." "They'll be arrested tomorrow," Catherine said firmly. "I'm confronting them at the shareholder meeting with the board and legal counsel present. Once I reveal the murder evidence publicly, they'll have nowhere to hide. Can you have officers ready?" "I'll be there personally," Detective Martinez promised. Catherine hung up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Tomorrow, Grant and Arthur would arrive at Sterling headquarters expecting to manage another crisis, to somehow salvage their collapsing scheme. Instead, they would face the woman they'd dismissed, the widow they'd humiliated, the mother Grant had struck across the face. And they would learn that underestimating Catherine Sterling had been the last and most fatal mistake of their miserable lives. The Sterling Industries boardroom fell silent as Catherine walked through the door at precisely 9 a.m. Grant and Arthur sat at the head of the table, surrounded by their legal team, looking exhausted but defiant. The remaining board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one had expected her to appear. "What is she doing here?" Grant demanded, half rising from his chair. "Security, remove this woman." "Sit down, Grant." Catherine's voice cut through the room like ice. She placed a leather portfolio on the table and nodded to Marcus Chun, who distributed copies of Richard's will to every board member. "I'm here as the majority shareholder of Sterling Industries. 100% ownership, signed and witnessed 3 weeks before Richard's death. Your succession documents were either forged or legally revoked. This company belongs to me." Arthur's face drained of color. "That's impossible. We had the paperwork verified." "You had fraudulent documents," Marcus interjected. "Mrs. Sterling has been the legal owner since the moment of Richard's death. Everything you've done since then, the board votes, the Omnicorp negotiations, the supplier ultimatums, has been unauthorized and illegal." Grant slammed his fist on the table. "You can't just walk in here and—" "I can and I am." Catherine remained standing, her hands steady on the back of the chair. "But we're not here just to discuss corporate control. We're here to discuss murder." The room erupted. Board members shouted questions. Arthur's lawyer demanded proof. Grant's face twisted with rage and something else, fear. Catherine waited for the chaos to subside, then continued. "Richard didn't die of natural causes. He was poisoned with thallium over a 4-month period, administered daily in his morning tea." She looked directly at Arthur. "The tea you prepared for him every morning, Arthur. We have the toxicology reports, the purchase records showing you bought thallium sulfate, witness statements, and forensic evidence. You murdered my husband." Arthur shot to his feet. "That's absurd. I would never. Richard was like a father to me." "You killed him to steal his company," Catherine said flatly. She turned to Grant. "And you helped him do it. You knew about the poisoning. You encouraged his dependence on Arthur. You stood by and watched your father deteriorate because you wanted his empire." "You're insane," Grant hissed. "I'm his son. I would never." "You're not his son." The words dropped into the room like stones into still water. Catherine felt 23 years of restraint finally break free. "My late husband made the right choice by not signing the will to you, even though I tried convincing him to do so. After all we did for you, and this was how you planned to pay us back." She paused, letting the moment stretch. "I think it's high time I let you know that you are adopted and not our biological son." Grant's face went blank with shock. Around the table, board members stared. Catherine pressed forward, her voice steady and merciless. "Richard saw what you'd become, greedy, entitled, cruel. He saw how you allied yourself with a murderer. He chose to protect his legacy from you because blood doesn't make you family. Character does. And you have none. The boardroom doors opened. Detective Martinez entered with 4 uniformed officers. Grant Sterling and Arthur Vance. You're under arrest for the murder of Richard Sterling and conspiracy to commit corporate fraud. As the handcuffs clicked around their wrists, Grant looked at Catherine with hatred burning in his eyes. She met his gaze without flinching. Arthur was already crying, his lawyer shouting about unlawful arrest. But Catherine felt only cold satisfaction as they were led away, 2 men who'd underestimated the widow, who thought violence and greed could triumph over justice. She'd saved Richard's legacy, and she'd ensured his killers would spend the rest of their lives in prison. Sometimes the people closest to us reveal their true nature only when they think they've won. Catherine Sterling was dismissed as decorative, underestimated because of her grace, and attacked because of her kindness. But beneath the polished exterior was a woman of steel who understood that real power isn't seized through violence. It's earned through relationships, loyalty, and integrity. She didn't just defeat her enemies, she let them defeat themselves by exposing their own cruelty and greed. In the end, justice prevailed not because of wealth or position, but because one woman refused to let evil triumph. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share it with your friends, and tell us what you learned in the comments below.